Is a better world possible? The challenges sometimes seem overwhelming. Billions of people have no access to education, health care, clean drinking water, or even basic human rights. Their poverty is compounded by corruption, conflict over resources, economic stagnation, and violence.
Some countries, whole generations of young people are being lost.
So the cycle goes on and on. So one has to break that cycle.
Where are the solutions? And who are the change makers who can create them? In the past few decades, a powerful force has emerged. New leaders finding new ways to tackle the world's biggest problems. Problems that governments and businesses alone have not been able to overcome.
This is a new language, a new way of looking at the world.
Very different structure, different framework, different reference points.
This global revolution is led by social entrepreneurs, innovative people who respond to local problems, engage their communities in solving them, and accelerate change.
What has happened during the last 5 years is breathtaking.
People have the power of transformation.
This series is an opportunity to learn from the most extraordinary social entrepreneurs, people whose visionary ideas and persistence have enabled millions to transform their own lives. These founding members of Ashoka's Global Academy for Social Entrepreneurship have lessons to offer us all about the power of our own potential. They all started small, from humble beginnings. You are invited to share their journeys, learn their insights, and about the tools they use to produce change.
We have a window of opportunity of a couple of
It's
years.
a chance that we have to think ahead.
The companies that get this are going to have a huge competitive advantage.
Whether you're in business, the media, government, universities, or the social sector, this series will expose you to a new way of thinking and working that will stretch your own beliefs about what's possible and how you can achieve it. Tepper Marlin has designed and built several innovative models for corporate social responsibility, beginning with a peace portfolio for investors in the 1960s.
I thought if questions like this became the kinds of things that analysts were asking companies about, there would be tremendous leverage. It would really change decisions in corporate boardrooms.
Shortly after, she founded the Council on Economic Priorities, which conducted groundbreaking research that helped launch the socially responsible investment movement. In the 80s and 90s, she created the best-selling book, Shopping for a Better World, and other powerful tools that enabled consumers to reward good corporate citizenship.
It was our first sense of having started a model which social entrepreneurs all around the world wanted to copy. And one of the major shifts was to start thinking of ourselves not in the U.S. but in a global context.
More recently, she has created SA 8000, a universal standard to help companies ensure good workplace conditions for their own employees and those of their suppliers. Tepper Marlin describes how she's built strategic partnerships to transform corporate practices worldwide.
I lived a very comfortable and secure and quite privileged childhood. I had a sister 10 years older. Both my parents worked. We had a house way in the country. And so it was a very rural, very quiet, very peaceful upbringing. I spent a lot more time with animals than with people. I was the kind of kid who daydreamed a lot. I think both my parents were very clear that girls could do anything. I was never told to behave a particular way because I was a girl, as a child at least. My mother was a very strong presence in my childhood. When she came home from work every day, there was always a sacred hour. It was the children's hour, whatever was going on. We would curl up in a chair and read together. So it's one of the reasons I've loved books and reading. We used to have dinner for 2 hours. My father ate very slowly. We always regarded dinner as a social occasion at which you had serious conversations. My mother did an enormous amount of research to find the academically strongest school within 100 miles of where we lived. It was called the Baldwin School outside Philadelphia, and it had a fabulous collection of really dedicated teachers. We all worked very, very hard, studied traditional things like Latin and history, had a wonderful science program, took women's education very, very seriously. It was really an intellectual center and a great formative experience for me. Every summer I did some kind of work project. I worked at a camp for orthopedically handicapped children. It was the first time I had experienced what life would really be like for inner city kids. These were children brought from the worst slums in New York who were orthopedically handicapped, some of them very seriously. Some of them knew that every summer they would get worse, that they weren't likely to live past 20. I got very attached to some of those children and learned an enormous amount from them. Kids who were so appreciative of the opportunity to just get to the country, be a little more independent than usual. I had a grandfather I was very, very close to, and he was someone who had arrived penniless at the age of 8 in New York City and went out to work himself. He was the most optimistic, wonderful, warm, actually well-read and well-spoken person you could imagine, and managed not only to finish high school but to put himself through City University. City University was totally free in those days. He went off at the age of 19 in the Army and ended up traveling through Asia and fell in love with it. And so my uncle, who was also very close and very important to me, my Uncle Fred, and my mother were raised partly in the Philippines. And our house always had many things from Asia around it, enormous respect for Asian culture and the Asian people. I went to Wellesley College, and I made wonderful friendships. Those were in my sophomore year. Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique came out, and we all stayed up all night, night after night, talking about it in great depth and thinking about how our lives would be different. We were going to have real careers. We were going to do something to change the world. We were going to dedicate our lives to stopping the Vietnam War, to addressing civil rights issues, to women getting equal opportunities in the workplace. And at the same time, sophomore year, had a course that really changed the way I looked at the world and at what I wanted to do in it. It was a wonderful sociology course, at which we spent most of the course looking at the cycle of poverty and how do you break into the cycle of poverty. And there was a report, the Moynihan report from the White House that said what you have to do to break the cycle of poverty is change the structure of black families. Well, most of us thought that was intrusive. That wasn't the way to get there. And as a result of thinking about that, I did my first piece of real original research. I went back to the census reports that study was based on and found that there was a much stronger correlation between family structure and poverty than there was between race and family structure. And it made it clear that the way to break out of the cycle of poverty was very simple. It was to get jobs and capital into the communities where you found the cycle of poverty. And that's what I decided that I wanted to do with my life. After college, I got right on a student ship, went to Europe, hitchhiked, slept in fields, slept under ruins of temples in Greece. I came back and wanted to find that job that I had envisioned at college. How would I be able to do something to break the cycle of poverty? I thought what I was looking for was to work for what were called MESBICs then, which were venture capital pools that would make loans to people in minority communities to start businesses. And I applied to those places and, to my chagrin, found out that they didn't think, however wonderful my degree in studying economics at a liberal arts college might be, they did not think that was what they needed. They needed people with business training and real business experience. So I thought, well, I'll go out and get it. So I came to New York. I stayed for 3 weeks with my uncle Fred Cummins, and he mentored me every day. He laid out a strategy with me of how to find the job that would position me for the best learning experience and the best chance for a real career. So I ended up with a job as a securities analyst at a major Wall Street firm. That was an enormous opportunity because at that time there were only about 6 women on all of Wall Street who were securities analysts. And in the process it meant I sat in on the meetings between the securities analysts and the heads of the department that were deciding which company was a buy, which was a sell, which was a hold, and why. And that was fascinating. It was a wonderful learning experience. Then they allowed me they asked me to do a paper on labor economics and actually gave me the title of labor economist. And the paper was to look at whether there was an acceleration in wage rates, if so, why, and also if it was a significant acceleration in the increase of wage rates, which industry sectors were most likely to benefit or suffer from it. And actually it was my boss who suggested, he said, this guy, the professor up at Harvard, a very famous guy named John Dunlop, he's kind of the dean of labor economics in the States. Why don't you call him up and see what he thinks? So I took a big gulp and I said, okay, and I managed to get an appointment, and I went up to Harvard, and, he gave me hours. And that paper ended up being one that got quite a lot of attention. The firm got letters in saying, this is the best research you've done in years. And here I'm the youngest in the department and I'm a woman. And I had a very special interest in doing that paper. And that was, why were we getting this acceleration in wage costs? And I thought that it might have something to do with the war. And what I was able to track down was that there was a shortage of men in their prime years. And they were either being drafted, or they'd gone to Canada or someplace else, or stayed in school to avoid the draft. That meant they weren't in the workforce. The firm made me move it to the back of the report because they thought it was maybe a little too political, but that's what the papers picked up. It was very interesting because in the months and years that followed that, there was a change in Wall Street's reaction to the war in Vietnam. Once people began to think about some of the costs to the economy of the war, as well as doubts about whether we were going to win the war, the markets started going down on news of acceleration in the war and up on news any possibility of peace. So that was a real lesson in the power of research and the power of press and the power of getting to influential people on Wall Street who could affect thinking and have an impact both on the business community's reaction and on what strategies were in Washington. I got more and more involved in anti-war activities on my own and left Wall Street to work on the McCarthy for President campaign because of its being, I thought, the best way to get us out of the war in Vietnam. So I got to do scheduling in advance for the McCarthy campaign. It was a great introduction to politics, logistics. And after the campaign, then began to think about what I would do next. I was approached by an investment firm in Boston, went to work for them as a financial analyst, and while I was there, the head of the firm was approached by a religious institution outside Boston to see if they could manage their portfolio without investing in any companies involved in the military-industrial complex or in the war in Vietnam. And I developed a peace portfolio. I met a guy named Henry Kendall, who was a professor at MIT, and a group of graduate students who were putting together an organization called the Union of Concerned Scientists, which went on to be another very important nonprofit voice for peace in the United States. And together we sat down and we figured out, how do you define which companies would be in such a portfolio and which would be out? How do you find their defense contracting records? We ran a very small ad just once in the New York Times Week of Review, and the response was way beyond anybody's expectations. We got 700 letters in from all over. There were individuals, but there were also big institutions. We got letters from the Ford Foundation, from Yale University, from the Rockefeller Foundation. So we saw that there was a lot of potential here. The reason we got so many responses to the idea of the peace portfolio is that it was a completely new idea. The only precedents were that some religious institutions had sin stock investments, and that they would not invest in companies that were involved in gambling or in liquor. The one other thing there was there had been a group called the Medical Committee for Human Rights, which had introduced a proxy resolution to Dow Chemical to ask them to stop producing napalm. So these two were the very original new things. One was to use social criteria in screening and selecting stocks, and the other was to be an activist stockholder and use the proxy mechanism in order to bring an issue to the attention of management and stockholders. And these proved over the years to be equally important, and the activist people and the screening people met and exchanged informations and strategies and worked together for many years. What I knew is that when I came in as a securities analyst and talked to a top executive of a company, they listened very, very carefully. And they were very eager to do whatever it was that would convince the analyst to put a buy order on their company. So I thought, if questions like this became the kinds of things that analysts were asking companies about, that they thought Wall Street cared about, that would reflect on the value of their stock, there would be tremendous leverage. It would really change decisions in corporate boardrooms. So I set up the peace portfolio and ran it for a while at the investment firm. But then when I wanted to move beyond the peace portfolio to do civil rights and the environment, I couldn't get the data I wanted. I spent months down in Washington trying to find the data, going to one government agency after another. I was used to dealing with the Securities and Exchange Commission. As an analyst, you had a wealth of information on the financial performance of companies. This is what enables Wall Street to do the kind of analysis I did. I assumed that the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission had similar information on employment of minorities and women. I assumed that the environmental agencies, the predecessors of the EPA, would have lots of information, and was shocked to find that none of that was true. I figured we needed a significant research department, and I did a little budget for it. Came out to about $500,000 a year. This is in late 1960s dollars, so that's quite a few $1,000,000 today, and went around with this idea to a number of the major Wall Street firms. Not one of them was willing to make that kind of investment. The only way I could see to do that was to leave the investment community and go into the nonprofit sector. So I had to learn about this whole strange new world of foundations and nonprofit organizations and how you set them up and what they do. I was fortunate enough in those early years to run into a fellow named Dick Fernandez, who had set up a group called Clergy and Laity Concerned About the War in Vietnam. And he set me up at the National Council of Churches with a tax exemption, an office, a copier, office equipment, and mentored me in how do you go about developing a proposal. How do you approach the Ford Foundation and the Rockefellers? And I went around and talked to individuals. Some of the very early ones who helped me out were a member of the House of Representatives named Dick Ottinger. And I met some of the most important people in my work life, like Lee Thomas, a long-time board member, funder, and mentor, and Bob Scrivener, the first director of the Rockefeller Family Fund. And our first grant was from the Rockefeller Family Fund. They had already made the decision. They just had to wait for the tax exemption to come through. That first year we operated on $30,000. We were 20 people, all young, all highly idealistic, all, really smart, dedicated people. We all work for $50 a week. We work round the clock. And we did a couple of really groundbreaking studies. One called Paper Profits that ranked the pollution control records of the major paper and pulp companies. We then did the same for electric utilities and for the steel industry. We ran through each industry that McGraw-Hill had identified as having the largest dollar cleanup job to do. It was a struggle to raise significant amounts of money because what we were doing doesn't sound very radical today, but it was viewed as astonishingly radical at the time we were started, in the late 1960s. Companies reacted by asking what in the world possessed us to think that we had the right to ask any of those questions, which were their private information. So it was a huge fight to get the information to begin with. And then when we released it, there was a big effort from a number of companies to keep the press from covering it. But one of the really nice things about it was that they miscalculated on the press. We had a big press conference releasing one of our first studies, the paper industry study. And at that study, one of the companies that was named as one of the 3 worst companies was so upset by being named one of the 3 that they sent out press releases denouncing the study. Well, of course, that alerted a lot of reporters who never would have known about our press conference to come to it. It looked pretty interesting. Controversy is what they like to write about. One of the things we discovered early on was that if we rated companies on their transparency, that gave us one more argument for why companies should disclose information. There was a pretty large element of the public and even the press that said, gee, if a company did something really stupid, we all make mistakes. Maybe they didn't realize that toxic chemical was really so dangerous. But if a company won't be honest about what their mistakes are and won't be honest about what their record is, they assume the absolute worst. That's why transparency and disclosure are so important. For me personally, the most important thing that came out of those early years of setting up the Council on Economic Priorities was that was how I met the love of my life, my husband of 34 years now. He was John Anthony Marlin when we met, and he was a professor teaching finance here in New York City for Baruch Business School. And he read about the research at the Council on Economic Priorities in, of all places, Playboy magazine. Now, here's a story. Playboy magazine did the story about me because they had just had a group of women feminists burning their bras outside Playboy for the way they portrayed women. And they had an editorial meeting and said, what should we do about this? And they brainstormed, and the guy who ran their foundation said, I just talked to a woman who's looking for some funding for a very interesting idea. She's setting up this group called the Council on Economic Priorities, and so they decided to do the story. And John read it. He says the only reason he was reading Playboy was that one of his old friends from Harvard was the editor and had sent free subscriptions to a group of his classmates. And he loved this story about the ranking of companies in the paper industry on their environmental records, and he was interested in what was the relationship between their profitability and their pollution control records. So he made an appointment. We had a lunch meeting, which was supposed to be about data exchange. We ended up having lunch for 6 hours. And it was really love at first sight. And he went ahead and compared the research ranking companies on their pollution control records with several different measures of profitability. And it showed that since World War II, companies that had been profit leaders but failed to invest in good pollution control equipment fell behind the rest of the industry. That got a lot of press, including a story in Business Week and an editorial in Business Week. We first met in the spring of that year, and we were married in September. And we talked before we were married about the plight of the millions and millions of orphans in the world. And we decided that we wanted to adopt children. So we were very fortunate. We were able to adopt 2 children from Korea, Caroline and Jay, who are now grown, and we had a wonderful experience raising them, both because they were wonderful children and because for us, it was like inheriting a whole new culture, and began what's been a lifelong interest in Asia. In the early years, CEP concentrated on doing in-depth research, which resulted in a series of books published by places like MIT Press. They were quite serious research. So first in the environment, we did all the industries that McGraw-Hill identified as having the largest cleanup job to do to comply with the Clean Air and Water Acts of the early 1970 and 71. Then we looked at a series on fair employment, and we started with a study called Shortchanged, Women and Minorities in Banking. Every one of them had a board of advisors that helped us define our criteria, checked the research. We were fortunate always to have pro bono legal help so that we protected ourselves from any chance of a liability suit. We also, after a few years, wanted to know what was our impact. And so 2 or 3 years after each of those groundbreaking studies rating a company's social or environmental performance, we went back and studied the same companies again to see what had changed in the interim. One of the things that made the institution credible and important, Council on Economic Priorities, was that a lot of those studies showed very substantial improvement, showed some companies that had been at the bottom that were really shocked, made major changes, and we knew that our studies had played a very significant role in bringing about those changes. We then moved on to look at some issues that were very important corporate issues, but were clearly government issues, not just individual company issues. So we did a number of policy studies. One was some really interesting research dug out from dockets of the mining regulatory agencies, which resulted in our testimony before Congress and our widely reported research in a study called Leased and Lost, was front page of the New York Times, was influential in changing the mineral leasing laws. We also did a series of public policy studies on military spending, particularly focusing on the adverse impacts of the enormous escalation of military spending during the Reagan years. We also did a significant series on nuclear power over the course of a decade, which demonstrated that nuclear power, which initially was introduced as promising electricity too cheap to meter, was turning out to actually be generating electricity as expensive as coal-fired and more expensive than other means of generating electricity. The net effect of that series ran against all the thinking in the nuclear power industry and were probably the most significant factor in the result that since 1978 not a single new nuclear power plant has been ordered in the United States. The Council on Economic Priorities set out to be the Dun & Bradstreet of corporate social responsibility. once we had this research for the investment community, we had made major breakthrough because we'd gotten data that was never available before. We'd rated companies in a way that had never been done before. We'd gotten major press, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Time magazine. The success in our mission was it had become, by the late 80s, a fairly normal, a fairly well-established part of the business community on Wall Street. There were a series of social and environmentally screened funds. There were several hundred proxy resolutions on social issues introduced at companies every year. That was a huge opportunity and a great success for us, but also it meant that the business community, with their preference for proprietary research, was competing with us in ways that were very difficult for us to respond to. One, they had much more money to invest in doing the research. And the second one is they had less concern than we, who were a public charitable institution, in the quality of the research. So CEP became also a consumer's report of corporate social responsibility, putting in the hands of consumers the information about the social and environmental records of the companies that made the cereals that they bought every day, or the brands of bread or cans of peas. Companies reacted even more strongly to a change in consumer preferences than a change in investor preferences. Why? We're talking about consumer companies. If a company feels that some factor would make a consumer to reach for their product rather than the competing product, and that might change their share of market 0.5% for one of dozens of products that the company was making, the bottom line impact on that was so important that companies were making sensible business decisions by investing significant amounts to be able to get their company to be one that consumers preferred rather than consumers avoided because of their social and environmental records. So you have enormous leverage there if you have a way of getting credible information out to large numbers of consumers. We did some campaign-oriented research, like one called the Campaign for Cleaner Corporations, where we identified the toxic 10 across all industries, which companies were responsible for the most damage to the environment. And we worked with Mother Jones magazine. Even Fortune magazine picked up some of them, so the business press picked it up as well. At the other end of the spectrum, realized more and more that we got an even stronger reaction when we recognized companies for doing something really outstanding and wonderful. So we got more and more interested in how we could use carrots and positive reinforcement. And in the early 80s began an awards program called America's Corporate Conscience Awards. And we had a gala awards program to recognize those companies. We would get hundreds and hundreds of people who would come. It became a source of income to help support the activities of the Council on Economic Priorities. The papers ran stories about the winners, and we found companies really vying and competing for wanting to win one of those America's Corporate Conscience Awards. And we also began to get much more mainstream press that focused on the opposite of the toxic 10. What were the companies doing the best job? And the big leap was when a business magazine first began to do this as a regular feature, and that was Fortune. And Fortune magazine, the first time they ran that, ran it as a major feature, and the second time it was their cover story. It's been a cover story several times since, and Fortune magazine still runs that article today. Just as in 1968, when 700 people responded to one tiny ad for a peace portfolio, I knew we were really on to something. In 1987, when we got public reaction to the book Rating America's Corporate Conscience, we knew we were on to something really big again. We began to get thousands, literally thousands, of letters of people wanting to buy the book because they wanted to use it in shopping. So we decided we needed to do, rather than a bookstore kind of book, a very small little consumer's guide, which we called Shopping for a Better World. And it was pocket-sized, so you could easily carry it to the grocery store with you. And it rated the companies that make almost everything you could buy in a grocery store or supermarket. The consumer could look up at the point of purchase any product, their brand of cereal, can of peas, a piece of clothing, and see which company made it and whether that company was a leader or a laggard in environment, employment of women, employment of minorities, community investment, charitable giving. And it was enormously popular. We self-published the first one. We had a big booth from Utne Reader. Eric Utne heard about this, and the Utne Reader purchased a copy of Shopping for a Better World for every subscriber and sent it along with one of their magazines. And suddenly we were swept away on a kind of a wave of publicity that we could never have imagined. Every radio show wanted to interview us, every newspaper around the country, not just the Washington Post and the New York Times, wonderful as they were, but, the leading newspaper in Dayton, in Cincinnati, in Chicago, in Des Moines. We were on the Today Show. Ballantine Books asked if they could make it into a mass paperback, which then meant the next year it was in every bookstore in America, and often, right in the front window because it was such a great seller. We sold more than 1 million copies of that book in the course of a few years. The times when Shopping for a Better World was getting such attention, I was chosen to win the Right Livelihood Award. The Right Livelihood Award is an alternate Nobel Prize to recognize social entrepreneurs. It was an amazing experience and an extremely humbling one, because the kind of work I do is a relatively safe thing. I'm not putting my life on the line by doing this. One of the other winners was an activist from Colombia, and between the time he was given the award and some months later when we all were brought to Stockholm for the presentation of the award, he'd been killed. Others of the award winners had been jailed for extensive periods of time. It was a very significant learning experience. Because Shopping for a Better World got such a high profile, so much attention, such great sales, we became a model that people in other countries wanted to follow. So we then had a series of visits with organizations from Germany, Italy, France, the Netherlands, England, Japan, Belgium, and the Scandinavian countries, all coming to see what are the research methods we could use, and how could we make it work in our country, because the laws are different, the amount of public disclosure is different, and cultural expectations are somewhat different. So it became really interesting. It was our first sense of having started a model which social entrepreneurs all around the world wanted to copy. The European and Japanese ones became big successes, were one of the reasons for the growth of social investing in Europe and in Japan, and did wonderful shopping for better worlds in their own countries. And one of the major shifts CEP began at that stage was to start thinking of ourselves not in a U.S. but in a global context. The second thing that moved CEP's scope way beyond domestic, where it had been, to the global environment, was after a while, we'd done maybe 4 Shopping for a Better Worlds, we started to do some for specific markets. And one of those was Shopping for a Better World for students. And it included a lot of apparel companies and sporting goods companies. And for the first time, we felt that our research was really inadequate. We had done a great job studying what these companies' environmental and employment practices were within the United States. That's what our database was. We were looking at what they did in their executive offices and maybe at their stores. But we missed all their factories because many of the brand name apparel and sporting goods companies, and increasingly everything we buy, isn't made in America anymore. It's designed in America, it's marketed in America, but it's made in developing countries. The first kernel for Social Accountability International and SA 8000 came from our America's Corporate Conscience Awards. We gave one in 1991 to Levi Strauss, because Levi Strauss was the first company to develop a code of conduct to govern the social and environmental responsibilities and records of the vendors, the suppliers, the producers of those jeans, whom they didn't own or manage, to work with companies to improve where they needed to come into compliance, and to drop those suppliers who were resistant and who refused to come into compliance with the code. We thought that was not only worth an award, but a program that cried out to be widely replicated, of bringing together a group of companies who we thought were most likely to want to develop a code like this. With those companies, we began to provide them technical assistance in what would a good code consist of, that it needed to be drawn from ILO conventions, that it needed to work in compliance with national law, how to promulgate it, how to design it so that it was applicable in countries with different laws and different cultures. We achieved our goal in that a few years later, hundreds and hundreds of companies had codes of conduct for their suppliers. But the codes were wildly different, even among the companies around the table with us, because they then went back with what they'd learned at CEP, and they ran it by their legal department, and they ran it by 6 other internal reviews and departments, and they ran it by their CEO, and they came out making lots of changes in it. And so the codes were not comparable to each other. It's very confusing for consumers. Too much work for them to decide which code were strict and which codes were pure window dressing. Furthermore, it was confusing for the factories and the workers, because the factories would produce for more than one brand company, and often they were supposed to comply with 7 different codes. You even hear stories of companies that have had 80 or 100 audits a year, each to a different code of conduct. So we then decided that what we really needed was an international standard, one code that counted universally for everybody. And that was how we produced Social Accountability 8000, which is this international global standard for decent working conditions. And so in 1997, when we were ready to release the standard, suddenly it seemed, just as shopping for a better world had become so influential and important a project, it almost defined CEP. Social Accountability International was such a significant organization in its own that we needed to spin it off and give it its own independence. When SAI was founded, I was able to arrange with the board of the Council on Economic Priorities to work for both organizations. Then, a couple of years later, made the transition to be able to work entirely for SAI. We brought together businesses, trade unions, human rights organizations, development agencies, child welfare organizations from all around the world to help us develop this standard SA 8000, to approve it and to oversee the system. That multi-stakeholder process was both a wonderfully fulfilling one and useful one and productive one, but also an enormous challenge, because we brought together at the table a lot of people who never had sat down to work in common with people from the other sectors before. You had corporate people who wouldn't dream of sitting down with trade union leaders in anything but adversarial negotiations. You had trade union leaders who believed that, any company executive was arch enemy number one. And there was so many different perspectives around that table. And so the challenge at that first meeting and the first several years' meetings was, how did you actually get that group to work together in a cooperative way with a real result? To do that, I drew on experiences of an organization called Search for Common Ground, an organization using conflict resolution and conflict prevention techniques in war situations. And I thought, this is almost like a war. The problems that I hear Search of Common Ground is addressing. We got everybody around the table to buy into the mission, to agree on it, to agree on its importance. And then we set some ground rules, like everybody at the table deserves to be listened to with respect. Everybody deserves to have time to make their points. We need to define terms, and we finally got there. We all agreed that the solutions were better than what any group would have thought of by themselves, and we still have that spirit today. The first certification to SA1000 was in 1998. As of the end of September 2005, there were 736 workplaces certified. Those workplaces were in 47 different countries, in 52 different industrial sectors, and they covered more than 450,000 workers. That is very good growth for a new and relatively small organization, but it's a drop in the ocean of the number of workplaces out there, particularly in the sectors that are strongly involved and where consumers are expecting improvements in workplace conditions. I guess from early childhood, one of the things that's most upset me is gross inequalities and unfairness. It's, I think, basic desire of children that things should be fair. It's called justice. It's a basic human right. And when you look at the world today, one finds a crushing lack of that kind of justice or human right. We have 1 billion people living on less than $1 a day, barely living, when we have others living in unbelievable luxury. And it seems something that we have the ability to fix, to do something about. And when our oldest child, who's now 31, was adopted, Korea was extremely poor. He and many other children had their first introduction to the world in an orphanage, being given up because parents couldn't afford to feed them. And those orphanages didn't have enough money. He was tiny. He was malnourished. He had to scream to get fed. And when that's your child, and you think, how could we let children start their lives in such dreadful circumstances when it doesn't take very much money to make that difference, and when we've seen development work to eliminate that kind of poverty. Korea is now a middle-class country. That is the kind of opportunity that should be available to everybody in the world. But at least the minimum we can possibly justify is that when we buy toys and clothes and food in this country, and in Europe, and in Japan for that matter, that at least the people who work to produce those products for us are paid a living wage, are able to send their children to school, are able to get a decent education, and are not themselves victims of abuse and sexual harassment in the workplace.
Alice Tepper Marlin is a pioneer in the corporate responsibility movement. She, with her organization Social Accountability International, has led the way in creating SA 8000, a global standard for decent workplace conditions. SA 8000 requires compliance from not only retail brand companies, but from their suppliers as well.
Now, at the beginning of this, nobody thought of holding a company responsible for another company that they purchased their products from, that they neither owned nor managed. That was a real paradigm shift.
In a world filled with thousands of separate company codes, confusing consumers, managers, and workers alike, Tepper Marlin recognized that the movement desperately needed a single code that counted universally for everybody.
This is a multi-stakeholder vision of the world, where everyone who has a stake in working conditions is working to the same standard and the same system and pulling together.
Tepper Marlin describes her strategy in bringing all parties to the table, an approach that has already produced dramatic results from some of the world's most powerful businesses.
My dream for the future is that every person in the world who does a job, wants to work, can do so in an environment that is fair and just. This is a multi-stakeholder vision of the world, where everyone who has a stake in working conditions is pulling together. That means not only do workers get exposed to less hazards in the workplace, get paid decently, not have to work themselves into exhaustion, that children are in school rather than in the factory so they can get an education. It also means better deal for business, that global businesses will not be exposing the reputations of their companies and their brands to significant risk. It means for the farm or the factory or the store that their workforce is going to be productive, that their products are going to meet high quality standards, that they'll have high retention and not the headache of constantly recruiting new people and training them. It means that civil society is involved in a significant way. They're involved in helping to inform and oversee the process. It means for concerned investors and consumers that they will be able to have some assurance that when they walk into a store or look on the internet and consider buying a product, the product was made under decent working conditions. SA 8000 and SAI play one small role, but important role, in realizing this vision. It's going to take every sector of society working together. When the activists are helping to push and inspire us to do the job really well, when businesses are really serious about making the kind of commitment it takes to assure that they meet consumer expectations and minimize the risks to their reputation, and meet the visions and expectations of their own forward-thinking managers. It means the trade unions working in a way so that employers and employees, the two most key stakeholders, are communicating with each other, that they're understanding each other, and that all of these parties are working to solve problems in a realistic and practical and achievable manner. This is not a utopia that we're going to get to tomorrow. SA 8000 offers a practical step-by-step way to improve and work towards achieving this vision in a way that benefits all of the parties involved.
Bill Drayton is the founder of Ashoka, Innovators for the Public. Ashoka works at the forefront of the rapidly growing field of social entrepreneurship. It supports the work of entrepreneurs worldwide who solve social problems in far-reaching, pattern-changing ways.
Our job is not to give people fish, it's not to teach them how to fish, it's to build a new and better fishing industry.
From modest beginnings in the early 1980s, Ashoka has grown into a community of over 1,500 fellows, supported by staff members, partners, and volunteers in over 50 countries.
88% of the people we elect at the end of 5 years have had other institutions copy their ideas. 59% have achieved national policy impact, and on average, they're serving 174,000 people.
Bill Drayton has been a social entrepreneur all his life. He shares his story to provide insights into what it takes to create widespread social change.
The development of Ashoka is very typical of the development of any major entrepreneurial venture. The idea, of course, dates back at least to the time I was an undergraduate. There was the challenge that came very sharp once I'd been in India. You must close this north-south gap. You must speed up development, democracy in the world. So there are many things that were very clear, but something was missing, and that was that the historical moment wasn't ripe, and also in our personal lives it wasn't ripe. We needed to go through our apprenticeship. I had to spend time at McKinsey learning how the world works, learning the key skills of how you cause change. Then, as I was at EPA, we sensed that the historical moment was coming. You could hear the hinge creaking. And what we were seeing very personally was that our friends, my friends in India and elsewhere, were starting to be social entrepreneurs. And what was happening was that the post-independence generation in Asia was coming of professional age. They were now in their 30s. Their parents thought getting control of the government, take over those instruments, that was the focus. The next generation grew in an environment with these overpowering government institutions, and some of them felt they could do better. And so you could see the beginning of a very significant wave of social entrepreneurs who were having a very difficult time. No word to describe the field, no support institutions, a lot of doubt ranging from their family to the government. Said, oh, this looks like this is the time. Then we asked, all right, well, how do we intervene? Where can you intervene which will have the biggest possible impact with very modest resources, all we could imagine available to us at the time? And that is the moment when a person and an idea have finished their apprenticeship, and they know, the entrepreneur knows that they have an idea that is the next big generic step for their field. Then all you want to do is go full-time and run with this idea, seize the historical moment. But who are you? what is this idea? It doesn't fit any of the existing patterns because they were set up to serve the old idea. At that point, a little bit makes all the difference. Very little money, so you can look your family in the eye and say, I know it's crazy to leave my tenured job in a nice, safe institution. You've got to be able to look them in the eye and say, you know, I'm going to do this. And we give you the financial ability to do that if you need it. But beyond that, you now are a part of a family of your peers, and your uncle can see that these people that are very respected in your society and internationally think your work is important, believe in you. The early years of Ashoka, as for almost all our fellows, raising money was a nightmare. No funding from any institutional foundation for our first 6 years. Basically, the Klingenstein, Lipkin, and Golden families, that was it. Then I was working part-time at McKinsey, commuting to New York. Ashoka was going, and it was a very crazy time. And that overload is what made the MacArthur sudden phone call in November of 1984, miraculous. The MacArthur Foundation had chosen me to be one of its fellows, which gave me 5 years income. And also, very importantly, for people who could not understand what Ashoka was about, gave me a sort of vaguely reputable category to fit into. It was a very key, liberating moment. I was able to go on leave from McKinsey, which I'm still technically on leave.
Muhammad Yunus is the founder of Grameen Bank. Grameen loans money for self-employment to over 4 million poor women in Bangladesh.
You cannot get a dollar without a dollar in your hand. In the poor people, nobody gives the first dollar to catch the next dollar.
Dr. Yunus designed Grameen to serve people who have no collateral. 5 borrowers form a group and guarantee each other's loans. The repayment rate is greater than 98%. More than half of Grameen's members have moved their families out of poverty.
We have demonstrated beyond anybody's doubt that it works and is sustainable, and it can work in all kinds of cultural and economic situations.
Grameen Bank has become a model for hundreds of microfinance programs around the world, serving tens of millions of the world's poorest citizens. In this program, Dr. Yunus shares the experience and insights gained in his struggle to build the world's leading poor people's bank.
I toyed around several alternatives. Finally, I decided maybe I should link them with the local bank. Bank is the one who should be lending money. This is their business. This is their job. So with enthusiasm, I go to the branch manager or the bank manager who is located in the campus, propose to him that he lend money to the poor people in the village. He fell from the sky. He couldn't believe I even said that. He said, no, it can't be done. It can't be done. I said, why not? Because, he said, poor people are not creditworthy. What does creditworthy mean? Creditworthy means he will not be able to pay back. I said, how do you know? Did you lend them at all? He said, no, I never lent them. So how do you know? He said, everybody knows that. Because they are poor, no matter how much money you give, they will eat and the money will be over. They can't pay you back. So I went to higher officials in the city, downtown. I talked to them. They said the same thing. So every time I go and see somebody, they tell me the same thing. And it went on for months. I couldn't find the door to open. Then I learned something from them and I used it. I said, why don't you accept me as a guarantor? I become your guarantor. I sign all your documents. Risk is on me, not on you. You give the money. I thought it's such a straightforward proposal, they will immediately go for it. They didn't. There were more than 6 months. Finally, I was accepted as a guarantor. And it worked. I was very excited that it worked. But the bank manager doesn't change his mind. He said it may work in one village, but if you do it in 2 villages, it will never work. I said, okay, let me do it in 2 villages. So I did it in 2 villages, it worked. He said, well, 1 village and 2 villages are the same thing. Maybe you should do it in 5 villages. So I did it in 5 villages, it worked. But he doesn't change his mind. After I have done this several rounds, and I realized that if I do the whole world, he's not going to change his mind. Maybe I should forget about him. So I thought maybe I should have a separate bank doing exactly what I'm doing. And that idea started haunting me, that why don't I have a bank for the poor people?
The Millennium Development Goals are an unprecedented effort to attack worldwide poverty simultaneously on many fronts.
Any development organization working for poverty alleviation and empowerment of the poor needs to really work on many different issues.
BRAC, formerly the Bangladesh Rural Advancement Committee, founded by Fazl Hassan Abid, has employed a multi-pronged strategy to attack poverty on a national level. BRAC's work has helped Bangladesh make significant strides.
In 1974-75, Bangladesh's fertility per woman was 6.5, and now nationally it's about 3. Life expectancy at birth in 1975 was 49, now it's 61.
Abid shares BRAC's experience in tackling such goals as establishing universal primary education, promoting gender equality, reducing child mortality, improving maternal health, and alleviating poverty. He offers a valuable roadmap to all those engaged in the struggle to reach these critically important goals.
I think the Millennium Development Goal is a good goal to work towards. Most of the goals or targets set is achievable, I think. And in Bangladesh, I think we will try and achieve all of it, all the goals. The first one, of course, is education of children, whether we could get all children into school and get them to complete primary education. We felt that if we ultimately had to improve productivity in this country, we needed to get our children educated for the next generation to be able to compete effectively in the globalized market. We have one group which is 8 to 10. We take them into primary schools and provide them 4 years of education, which covers 5 years of primary schooling. And then we have got another group, where mostly girls, but some boys, 10 years to 14 years. Those children who, for whatever reasons, have not had the opportunity to have an education. Since they are older children, we provide them 3 years of education to cover 5 years of curriculum. And they can do that. Most of them complete 5 years of primary schooling in 3 years. So we have got these 2 groups of children who come to our schools. The reason for these schools are that there are many children who don't enroll themselves into any primary school. So we wanted to mop up these children who has never had an opportunity to go to a primary school. So that was one. And secondly, we also found there's a large number of children who went into a primary school, enrolled themselves, but then dropped out without any meaningful learning. So we felt that we also needed to provide them a second chance so that they have an access to education, at least primary level education. The reason we call our school system non-formal primary schools is because if we said they were primary schools, the government has got a particular rule as to how many classes you must have, how many teachers you must have, you must adopt the government curriculum. So we felt that we would be outside the government system. We wanted to experiment with new ways of teaching, learning. We needed to develop new curriculum, new materials. So we called our schools non-formal, But then, if you look at the structure of our schools, they are more formal than the formal schools, in the sense that the classes start, particular time is finishes, teachers come on time, there is a structure of teaching, learning, subjects are taught every day. There are 270 days a year that the classes take place. In most government schools, probably in less than 200 days, classes are held. But we call it non-formal simply because we didn't want to abide by all the rules that is set for a primary school. We set up these schools in each village with 30 children and one teacher. We thought that these children would be quite happy receiving 5 years of primary education. But we were taken aback, quite surprised, when we found that 90% of our children who completed primary schools actually went on to high school. We expanded to 35,000 schools. And we have 1.2 million children in our schools. We ourselves fund about 350 NGOs to run BRAC-type schools. So I think it has been adopted in Bangladesh quite well. But in Bangladesh, if you look at the statistics, there are 19 million children in the age group of 6 and 10. Approximately 3 million children are out of school right now, still not going to school. So if we had more resources, I think we could have had 100,000 schools and mopped up all the children who are out of school presently. So because we don't have the resources we need, we can't expand to that level.